As I opened the door, her lips met mine unexpectedly. It was a jolt like a lightning strike, something I couldn't quite grasp. For a brief moment, everything around us froze. The noise from the street, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, even the air in the room felt still. My stepmom. The kiss was fleeting, barely there, yet it hit me with the force of a freight train. She pulled back, turning her face away, clearly shaken by the moment we just shared. My heart raced, and I found myself at a loss for words. This wasn't something we had planned, or even something I thought could occur. Yet it had. Her hand trembled slightly as she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't mean for that to happen," she stammered, her voice quivering. She looked just as shocked as I felt. The weight of the moment hung heavily over us, and for the first time, I viewed her as more than just the distant woman who married my father. This wasn't merely a mistake. It was something significant that couldn't be brushed aside. I stood there, frozen, still tasting her lips. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend the implications of what had happened, but disbelief clouded my thoughts. I couldn't form a single coherent idea. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, filled with a mixture of confusion, regret, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry," she whispered before walking away, leaving me standing there, engulfed in a storm of emotions. That kiss marked the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for, and it was merely the start. After that night, everything felt altered. We never spoke about the kiss. I didn't bring it up at all. Yet, it lingered between us like an unspoken whisper that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Each time we crossed paths in the house, that moment hung over us. I began to see her in a new light, noticing details I had overlooked before. The way her fingers glided along the edge of her glass at dinner, how she anxiously tucked her hair behind her ear when she thought no one was watching. It was as if I was seeing her for the first time. But I couldn't grasp why I felt this way, nor did I know how to process it. I felt confused, guilty, and excited all at once. I lost myself in thoughts, replaying that moment repeatedly. Was it just a fluke? A moment that should never have occurred? Or was there something deeper? Each time I looked at her, the same question echoed in my mind. Did she regret it? Or did she feel the same magnetic pull I did? One evening, about a week after the kiss, I walked into the kitchen to find her cooking dinner as if everything was perfectly normal. The aroma of roasted vegetables filled the air, yet I struggled to focus on it. I stood there awkwardly, uncertain whether to speak up or just slip away. She didn't turn to face me, but I could sense she was aware of my presence. The tension between us felt suffocating. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember that night?" She didn't look at me, her back still turned as she chopped the vegetables, but her words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. I swallowed hard, uncertain of how to respond. "Yeah, ido." A long pause followed. She halted her chopping, resting her hands on the cutting board but still didn't turn around. "It was a mistake. You know that, right?" Her voice wavered, yet there was something in her tone that suggested she might not fully believe what she was saying. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, a mistake." Yet, even as I spoke, those words felt hollow. Was it truly just a mistake? Or was it something we both craved, but were too scared to admit? Finally, she turned to face me, and for the first time since that night, our eyes locked. Fear flickered in hers, but there was also a peculiar vulnerability. "We can't let it happen again," she said softly, almost like a plea. However, the way she looked at me, with that hesitation, made me think she wasn't as certain as she claimed. I nodded again, though my thoughts were anything but clear. Yeah, of course, but deep down, I knew we weren't finished with this. The kiss had transformed everything, and pretending it never happened wouldn't erase the feelings that had surfaced. I could see it in her eyes. I could feel it in the thickening air each time we found ourselves alone. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She stood there, gripping the counter as if trying to steady herself, looking just as lost as I felt. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I wasn't sure either of us knew how to stop the momentum that had begun. From that point onward, I couldn't shake the sense that we were both balancing on the brink of something perilous, something beyond our control. Every glance, every word, even the silences between us felt charged, like we were both bracing for the next step, even if we didn't want to admit it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I didn't want to halt it. A week passed, but the tension between us only intensified. Every interaction, every exchanged glance felt like a game we were both engaged in, even though we didn't understand the rules. I tried to convince myself to stop thinking about her, to let that kiss fade into a distant memory, but it didn't work. She was everywhere in my mind. The way my heart raced when I heard her footsteps, the awkward silences that filled the spaces we shared. Then came the day when everything shifted. It was late afternoon, and I had just returned from running errands. My phone buzzed with a message from my dad, letting me know he'd be working late again. The house was quiet when I arrived home, and I assumed she was out as well. As I headed toward my room, however, I heard faint music drifting from the garage. Curious, I followed the sound. There she was, seated in the driver's seat of her car, the garage door open, and the soft melodies from the radio filling the space. When she looked up and noticed me, a small, surprised smile spread across her face. "I didn't realize you were back," she said softly, her tone hesitant. I shrugged in response. "Yeah, I just got in." I pointed toward her car. "Is everything all right?" She sighed, switching off the radio as she stepped out of the car. "I was just thinking," she replied, running a hand through her hair. "Needed a little time alone." In the quiet of the garage, the air felt charged with the tension that had been brewing for weeks. I knew I should have walked away, to leave before anything else could unfold, yet something kept me anchored in place. I could see the same inner conflict reflected in her eyes, an urge to move on from what had transpired, but also the magnetic pull of something deeper. "I've been thinking as well," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. When our eyes met, I saw that same internal struggle mirrored back at me. There was confusion, guilt, and an unspoken truth that both of us were too afraid to name. For a fleeting moment, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, she took a step closer to me. My heart raced as she bridged the gap between us. Her hand grazed against mine, so feather-light that I almost didn't register it, but that single touch ignited a spark within me. "I can't stop thinking about it," she murmured, her voice quaking, and before I could respond, her lips were on mine once again. This time it was different. It wasn't a mere accident. It was intentional and charged with meaning. I returned her kiss, pouring into it all the weight of our unspoken emotions. This kiss felt entirely different from the first. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was raw and genuine, and it frightened me. She was the one to pull away first, her breath shallow, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and something we shouldn't have felt. "I started to say," she began, but the words faltered on her lips. She didn't need to finish. We both understood what she meant. Yet here we stood. "We can't keep doing this," she said softly, though her hand remained on my arm, her fingers trembling slightly as they clung to me. "It's wrong." I nodded, even though those words felt hollow. "I know," I replied, but doubt lingered in my mind. Sure, it felt wrong, but it also felt unavoidable, like we were being swept into something neither of us could control. An extended silence fell between us. She released my arm and stepped back, running a hand through her hair once more, as if trying to shake off the heaviness of the moment. "We need to put an end to this before it escalates." I wished I could agree, to assure her that we could stop, to return to how things had been before. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. Not now. And, judging by the way she looked at me, I sensed that she felt the same. She must have caught my uncertainty, because she let out a deep sigh, her shoulders sagging. "This can't happen again," she said, more to herself than to me. Yet, there was no conviction in her voice, just weariness. She looked at me, her eyes imploring. "Please." I nodded, even as a knot twisted in my stomach, indicating that halting this now would be harder than either of us wanted to admit. I'll go," I said, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. She studied me for a moment, as if waiting for me to actually leave. But when I didn't move, she stepped closer again. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, before I could reply, she kissed me again. This kiss carried a sense of urgency, as if she were grasping for something slipping away. I kissed her back, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us faded, leaving just the two of us and the weight of everything unsaid. When we finally broke apart, the silence in the garage felt deafening. She stepped back, her eyes filled with guilt, but also something deeper, something that hinted at this not being over yet. "We need to be cautious," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't let this happen again." But even as she spoke, I realized it was too late. The boundary had already been crossed, and there was no turning back. After that second kiss, everything shifted. Externally, things appeared the same. We continued our routines and pretended that nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the air was thick with the knowledge that we had crossed a line neither of us knew how to uncross. Every shared moment felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the right word or glance to set it off. I had no idea how long we could maintain the charade, but it was clear she was trying to avoid the truth. She began to withdraw from the house when I was around. If she happened to be in the living room, she'd make an excuse to leave the moment I entered. If I entered the kitchen, she'd rush to finish whatever she was doing and disappear. I noticed her dodging my gaze more than once, and for the first time, it felt as if she was fleeing from me, from us. But we both understood that it wasn't just about that kiss anymore. Something larger was brewing between us. Something we both recognized, but were too stubborn to confront. We were trying to outrun it, hoping it would vanish if we simply ignored it. Yet it lingered behind us like a shadow, growing more pronounced with each passing day. One evening, just a few days after our encounter in the garage, my dad had left for a work trip, leaving only the two of us in the house. I didn't expect to see her. I had become accustomed to her avoiding me. But when I stepped into the living room, there she was, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. The television was on, but she wasn't really paying attention. Her gaze was distant, lost in her own thoughts. I paused at the doorway, uncertain whether to join her or retreat. Every instinct urged me to turn back and dodge whatever conversation was looming. Yet something kept me anchored in place. Maybe it was the look on her face, exhausted and almost vulnerable in a way I had never noticed before. The walls she had constructed between us were beginning to falter, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if we were back in that garage, standing on the brink of something we couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, I approached and sat on the couch, careful to leave some space between us. At first, she didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could sense the tension mounting, thick and suffocating. The silence stretched on, becoming increasingly unbearable. Finally, she broke it, her voice barely a murmur. "We can't keep doing this." I knew she was right, but I was at a loss for words. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow or meaningless? We both understood the gravity of the situation, and pretending otherwise wouldn't alter the truth. Still, I felt compelled to say something, anything to relieve the weight in the room. "I know," I replied, though even I could tell my words sounded feeble. She sighed, taking a sip of her wine, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't understand what's wrong with me," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I never imagined. I know this is wrong, but I can't help thinking about it. About you." Her confession hung in the air, making the space feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in. My heart raced, and I struggled to keep my breath steady. There it was, the unspoken truth we had both been avoiding. She was thinking about me. About us. Just as I had been. "I've been thinking about it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Saying it out loud for the first time gave the words a weight I wasn't prepared to carry. There was no turning back now. We were entangled in this, whatever it was. She finally lifted her gaze, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I had no answer. How could I? Everything about our situation felt wrong, yet it also seemed like something we couldn't simply walk away from. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I can't act like nothing happened." Her expression softened. And for the first time in days, I saw that same vulnerability in her eyes that had been there the night we first kissed. She set her wine glass on the table and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. Neither can I. A long pause enveloped us, and I could feel the weight of her admission sinking in. We were both stuck in something that felt impossible to escape, and neither of us had the slightest idea how to resolve it. She broke the silence again, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just the kiss, is it?" I shook my head. "No, it's not." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders drooping. "I don't know how we got to this point," she said more to herself than to me. "But we need to figure this out before it spirals out of control." I wanted to agree with her, to reassure her that we could put a stop to this, to insist that we could go back to how things were before. But deep down, I realized that was impossible. We had crossed a boundary, and there was no way to erase it. I could see the understanding mirrored in her eyes. She wanted to halt this, but we were both too far gone. Suddenly, she stood up, shattering the tension. "I need some air," she said, and before I could respond, she stepped through the back door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I watched her from the window as she stood on the patio, arms wrapped around herself, staring out into the night. She looked so small and lost, and I wanted to reach out to her, to assure her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't, not this time. As I sat there in the stillness of the living room, the weight of everything that had transpired pressed heavily on me. I knew that regardless of what we did next, there would be no going back. The truth was out in the open now, and we had to confront it, whether we were prepared or not. I remained on the couch for what felt like hours, waiting for her to return, but she didn't come back. The night dragged on, filled with uncertainty about what would come next. After that night on the couch, everything between us began to unravel. It felt like we were both teetering on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to take a step forward or retreat. But deep down, we both knew one thing. We couldn't continue this way. Something had to change. We started to avoid each other more than before. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Each time I heard her footsteps, I found an excuse to leave the room. If I heard her in the kitchen, I'd wait for her to finish whatever she was doing before entering. We moved around one another like specters, pretending not to acknowledge the growing chasm between us, but it was impossible to maintain that pretense for long. One evening, about a week after our last talk, my dad called to inform me that he'd be away for a few more days. Work was keeping him late again. As soon as I hung up the phone, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I knew that meant I'd be alone with her. And despite my determination to stay strong, I realized we were running out of excuses. It was late, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet my racing thoughts. Every thought circled back to her. The way she had looked at me that night, the fear in her voice when she admitted she couldn't stop thinking about us. I kept reminding myself that it was wrong, that we needed to stop before everything imploded. Yet the harder I fought those thoughts, the more they consumed me. Then I heard a knock on my door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, a soft, tentative tap. I knew it was real. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending to be asleep. But deep down, I knew she would see right through that. She knew I was awake. I got up and opened the door, and there she stood in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to keep it all together. Her eyes were wide and uncertain, mirroring the fear I felt inside. "Can we talk?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She walked past me, pausing briefly before settling onto the edge of my bed. I lingered by the door, unsure of how to respond or what to say. The room felt constricted, too quiet, as if the walls were slowly closing in on us. "I don't know what to do anymore," she confessed, her voice quivering. "I've been trying to figure this out, to make it stop, but I just can't. I don't know how." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her I felt the same, that I was just as lost, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, staring at her, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired between us. "I thought I could handle it," she continued, her hands gripping the edge of the bed tightly enough that her knuckles turned pale. But it's not going away. Every time I see you, every time we're alone, it just gets worse. Her confession lingered in the air, and I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. This was it. We were at a crossroads where we either faced the truth or ran from it. But running didn't seem like a viable option anymore. I know, I finally said, my voice barely audible. I feel the same way. She looked up, searching my eyes for reassurance or perhaps an answer, but I had none to offer. All I could provide was the same confusion and the magnetic pull that had been drawing us together for weeks. We can't keep doing this, she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her tone. She didn't believe it any more than I did. I know, I echoed, but the words felt empty. We had repeated this sentiment so many times that it had lost all significance. We couldn't keep going like this, yet we were still tangled in it, and stopping seemed impossible. A long silence stretched between us. She turned away, still gripping the bed's edge, and I noticed the tension in her shoulders. She was struggling, fighting something within herself, but I could also see the cracks forming. She was breaking. I tried to avoid you, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I thought if I stayed away, it would help, but it only made things worse. Before I even realized what I was doing, I moved closer, my feet carrying me toward her. I sat down beside her, the bed creaking under our weight. She didn't look at me, but I could feel the warmth radiating off her body, the tension surrounding her like a force field. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that we were both trapped in something beyond our control, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it broke the dam. She turned to me, and before I could process what was happening, her lips were on mine once more. This kiss was unlike the others, desperate and almost frantic, as if she were trying to drown out everything else for a moment. It felt like everything else faded away, the guilt, the confusion, the fear. It was just us, immersed in the weight of everything we had kept hidden. But then she pulled back, her breath coming in quick gasps, her eyes wide with panic. We can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is wrong. We have to stop. I nodded, though my heart raced and my mind spun. I know, I said, but deep down, I understood the truth. We had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and no matter how much we told ourselves to stop, it was too late. She stood up abruptly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. Before I could respond, she turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. I sat there in the darkness, the silence enveloping me, and for the first time, I grasped just how far we had fallen. There was no going back. The morning after she walked out of my room, everything felt different. The house looked the same, familiar walls, the clock ticking in the hallway, the faint sound of traffic outside. But inside, it felt like the air had shifted. The weight of last night's events loomed over me like a dark cloud, suffocating and pressing down on my chest with each breath. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I got dressed, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, pretending I wasn't waiting for her to walk in. But she never came. The house felt empty, and it was as if I was the only one left to deal with the aftermath of our actions. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her lips felt against mine, the desperation in her eyes when she pulled away, and the finality in her voice when she said we had to stop. It replayed in my mind like a broken record, and no matter how hard I tried to concentrate on anything else, my thoughts kept circling back to her, to us. By the time afternoon rolled around, I knew I had to leave the house. Sitting there alone with my thoughts wasn't helping. I grabbed my keys and headed out, no specific destination in mind, just driving to clear my head. The streets were bustling, the sun shining brightly overhead, but I barely registered it. My mind remained fixated on that kiss and the way she had looked at me afterward, as if she were unraveling before my eyes. I found myself at the park, the same place I used to visit as a kid. It used to be a sanctuary, a space where life felt uncomplicated. before this mess settled over me like a heavy fog. I parked the car and wandered aimlessly, not paying attention to where I was headed, just needing to escape the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. The park was serene, with only the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze and the distant laughter of children playing somewhere out of sight. I settled onto a bench, staring at the ground, trying to wrap my mind around everything that had unfolded in the past few weeks. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, nothing fit into a coherent narrative. My phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the silence. I pulled it out, my heart racing when I saw her name flash across the screen. For a moment, I just stared at it, caught between whether to answer or let it go. But I knew I couldn't ignore her, not after everything. I swiped to answer, my throat tightening as I spoke. "Hey!" A long pause stretched on the other end, her breathing shallow and uneven, as if she were grappling for the right words. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice a mere whisper. "I shouldn't have walked out like that." "It's okay," I replied, though it wasn't. Nothing about this was okay. But what else could I say? I couldn't blame her for wanting to escape. I had felt that urge too. "I can't stop thinking about it," she continued, her voice cracking. "About last night. About everything." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the flood of emotions her words stirred within me. "Neither can I." Another long pause followed, and I sensed the tension building again when she spoke next. "We need to talk face to face." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, we do." We agreed to meet at a cafe downtown, somewhere neutral, away from the house and all the baggage that came with it. I wasn't sure what we would say or if there was anything left to discuss, but I knew we could no longer avoid it. We had to confront the truth, whatever that entailed. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already there, seated at a table by the window. She looked different, exhausted and worn, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she gazed out the window, lost in her thoughts. I sat down across from her, and for a moment, silence enveloped us, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel the tension mounting with every second that passed. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to fix this." I had no answers. How could I? There was no simple solution, no magic fix to make everything revert to normal. We had crossed the line, and there was no going back. "I don't think we can fix it," I replied quietly. "Not after everything that's happened." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I don't understand how we got here." I lowered my gaze to the table, my mind racing. I wished I could say something to ease her pain, something that could take away the heaviness in her voice. But there were no words, nothing that could make this right. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "It's tearing us apart." "I know," I admitted, my chest aching under the weight of her words. "But I don't know how to stop." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with such sadness it made my heart ache. "We have to end this for both our sakes, before it gets worse." I wanted to agree, to reassure her that we could stop and return to how things once were. But I knew it wasn't that simple. We were too deep into this. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what this will do to us, to our family." Her words struck me hard, the reality of what we had done crashing down around us. We weren't just risking our feelings. We were jeopardizing everything. The life we had built with my dad, the family that had taken years to piece together. And for what? A moment of weakness? A connection we didn't fully understand? "I'm scared too," I said, my voice heavy with guilt. "But I don't know how to fix it." She wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "We have to stop. We need to put an end to this before it destroys everything." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced it was possible. "Yeah, we do." The silence between us was suffocating, filled with everything left unsaid. For the first time, I realized just how fragile our situation had become. We were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, and one wrong step could send us tumbling into the abyss. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a while," she finally said, her voice quaking. "I think we need some space to figure things out." My heart sank at her words, But deep down, I knew she was right. We couldn't continue living like this, pretending everything was okay. We needed distance, time to breathe and reflect. Okay, I replied, though that single word felt like a betrayal. She stood up, grabbing her bag from the chair beside her. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice thick with emotion. Before I could respond, she turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with the weight of our choices. The house felt eerily quiet after she left. Not just the typical emptiness of an unoccupied space, but a heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. Each room felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. I had no idea how long she planned to stay with her friend. Days, weeks, or even longer. The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I didn't have the courage to ask. I kept telling myself it was for the best, that the space would help clear the air and give us both a chance to figure things out. Deep down, I understood it wasn't that straightforward. The harm was done, and no amount of time apart could reverse what had transpired between us. For the first few days, I tried to keep myself occupied. I spent countless hours at work, clocking in overtime just to avoid returning home to the emptiness that awaited me. When I wasn't at the office, I drove aimlessly around the city, hoping the movement would distract me from the chaos that was my life. But no matter how far I traveled, my thoughts trailed behind me, sticking to every quiet moment. Then came the day when I could no longer evade it. My dad called to tell me he was coming home early from his business trip. He didn't mention her absence, and I figured she must have told him she was staying with a friend. The thought of facing him, of pretending that everything was okay, filled me with dread. How could I act as if nothing was amiss when my entire world was crumbling? I arrived home late, trying to postpone the inevitable, but there was no escaping it. As I opened the door, I found my dad sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, his face etched with concern. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "You okay? You've been putting in a lot of late hours." I nodded, avoiding his eyes as I tossed my keys onto the counter. "Yeah, just busy." He took a sip from his drink, scrutinizing me for a moment before placing the glass down. "You sure? You seem a bit off lately." Guilt twisted my stomach as I felt his gaze searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. I could sense his eyes on me, probing for the truth, but I didn't have the strength to lie. Not anymore. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice trembled slightly. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water, using the task to keep my hands occupied, anything to avoid meeting his gaze. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You know, your stepmom has been staying with her friend for a few days. She said she needed some time away. Did she mention anything to you about it?" My heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, I thought about confessing, letting it all spill out. But the idea of his reaction, the betrayal, the hurt froze me in place. I couldn't do that to him. I couldn't shatter everything he believed in, everything we had built as a family. "She mentioned it," I said, my voice strained. "I think she just needed a break." He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. We both sensed that something was amiss, yet neither of us was prepared to confront it. Silence enveloped us for a while, the tension thickening with each passing second. I felt the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on me, suffocating. I wanted to scream, to confess, to lay it all bare, but I couldn't, not yet. "Listen, kid," my dad finally broke the silence. "I don't know what's happening with her, but if you know something, if there's anything you need to discuss, I'm here. You can talk to me." I felt nauseous. The words were right there, ready to spill from my lips, but I couldn't bring myself to utter them. How could I tell him that his wife, the woman he trusted and loved, had crossed a line with me? How could I admit that I had crossed it with her? "I'm fine, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Really?" He nodded again, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He didn't press me further, yet I knew he wasn't satisfied. He sensed something was off, something unsaid, but he didn't know how to reach me, and I didn't know how to let him in. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the burden of the lie weighing heavily on me. I couldn't keep this facade up any longer. The guilt was consuming me, and with each passing day, it only grew worse. I couldn't pretend everything was okay when I had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next morning, I woke up to find my dad had already left. He'd left a note on the kitchen table, saying he'd gone to the office early and that we'd talk later. I knew what that meant. He wasn't going to let this slide. He wanted answers, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep them from him. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen as I wrestled with whether or not to text her. We hadn't spoken since she left, and I had no clue where we stood. Was she as torn up about this as I was? Or had she already moved on, trying to leave it all behind? Before I could dwell on it too long, I sent a simple message. We need to talk. The reply came back faster than I anticipated. Meet me at the park. Same spot as before. My heart raced as I slid into the car, the familiar anxiety creeping up as I drove to the park. The same place where everything had begun to unravel. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted her sitting on the same bench where we had our last conversation, her face lined with worry. I took a seat beside her, the silence stretching as we both struggled to figure out how to start this discussion. I don't know what to do anymore, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought some time apart would help, but it's just made everything worse. I can't stop thinking about it, about you. Her words sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. Yet there was also a strange sense of relief. I wasn't in this alone. She was just as troubled as I was. I feel the same way, I admitted, keeping my voice low. But we can't keep doing this. We're hurting everyone, including ourselves. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know, but I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to go back to the way things were. Neither did I. We were teetering on the brink of something beyond our control, and no matter how hard we tried to pull back, the gravity of it kept drawing us forward. She reached out, taking my hand in hers, her grip tight, as if she were terrified to let go. What are we going to do now? I asked, but deep down I had no answer. All I was sure of was that we couldn't keep living this lie. Something had to change, and I was terrified that when it finally did, everything would come crashing down around us. I don't know, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. The atmosphere between us that day felt altered, heavy, suffocating, as if each word we exchanged was dragging us deeper into the quicksand we had created. Sitting side by side, our hands barely touching, we both knew this conversation was our last chance to halt the impending disaster. Yet, neither of us had any idea how to break free from this tangled mess. She looked at me, her eyes swollen and red from crying, struggling to keep her emotions at bay. I can't keep living like this, she murmured, her voice cracking. If we keep going, we're going to destroy everything. I know, I said, my throat tight with emotion. I don't want to hurt him. The weight of that realization hit me harder than I anticipated. My dad didn't deserve any of this. He had placed his trust in both of us, and here we were, unraveling that trust with each passing moment. We should tell him, she suggested suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, but each word felt like a knife to my gut. He deserves to know. Her suggestion lingered in the air, sending a cold wave of panic coursing through me. Tell him? Tell him what? That his wife and son had betrayed him in the most appalling way possible? That we had crossed boundaries we could never uncross? We can't tell him, I insisted, shaking my head. It would shatter him. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with despair. What are we supposed to do? Continue lying to him? Pretend everything is fine when it's all falling apart? Her voice rose in intensity before she caught herself, scanning the park for prying ears. The last thing we needed was for someone to overhear us. I ran a hand through my hair, my thoughts racing. I hadn't considered this outcome, hadn't allowed myself to think about what the truth would mean. But now that she had put it on the table, there was no way to take it back. I couldn't shake the image of my dad's face. If he found out, his world would collapse, and everything between us would be irrevocably changed. Maybe we don't have to tell him, I said, the words spilling out before I had fully processed them. Maybe we can just end this. Stop it now, and he never has to find out. She stared at me, disbelief clear in her eyes. You really think we could just stop? Go back to acting like none of this ever happened? I wasn't sure we could, but the thought of telling him felt like stepping into a hurricane, knowing it would destroy everything in its wake. I don't know, I replied quietly, but I'm not ready to ruin his life, not yet. She looked down at her hands, and the silence between us thickened, pulling us both under. I could sense her internal struggle, torn between doing what was right and what was necessary to weather the storm. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. I can't keep pretending, she said softly. I thought I could, but every time I see him, I feel like I'm lying to him. I feel like I'm betraying everything we've built together. I swallowed hard, the heaviness of her words crushing me. So what do we do? I asked. She hesitated, her hand slipping away from mine, severing the connection between us. For the first time, I felt as though we were truly losing each other. The distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was real and palpable. I'm leaving, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Not for a few days. This time it's for good. Her words struck me like a blow to the chest. What? I asked, my voice trembling. You're leaving? She nodded, biting her lip to keep it from quivering. I can't stay here. Not after everything that's happened. It's not just about us anymore. It's about him. He deserves better than this. Better than me. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend her decision. You can't just walk away. What about? She interrupted me, her voice firm this time. What about us? There is no us. Not anymore. Maybe there never was. The finality of her words left me speechless. I felt as if the ground beneath me was giving way, and I had no means to halt the descent. I wanted to say something, anything, to convince her to stay, but the reality was she was right. There was no future for us, at least not one that wouldn't end in heartache and chaos. I'm sorry, she said, rising slowly from the bench, each movement deliberate. But I have to go before we cause even more damage. I watched her turn and walk away, her silhouette fading into the distance, leaving me alone on the bench. I wanted to call out to her, to beg her to stop, but deep down, I knew nothing I said would alter her mind. This was it. It had to be. The stillness of the park surrounded me as I sat there, my thoughts spiraling, my heart heavy. I lost track of how long I remained in that spot, staring at the place where she had vanished. By the time I finally stood to leave, the sun was already setting. As I walked back to my car, a torrent of questions swirled through my mind, none with clear answers. How would I face my dad when I got home? How would I carry the weight of everything that had transpired? And could I really let her go? When I reached the car, I paused, staring at the steering wheel, my heart racing. I wanted to believe that things could return to normal, that I could simply move on from this. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. And the hardest part? I still didn't know how to let her go.